talk to you today. My outline will be I'll talk a bit about the background of my study, why I chose this topic, research question, rationale, theoretical framework, methodology, preliminary findings, and hopefully my conclusion. And so, just brief background as to why I chose this topic. I chose to study Ogoni land partly because I left Nigeria at 15 years old, and all throughout my time in Nigeria, we never actually, doing history there, we never actually talked about the Ogonis and their struggle, which was very prominent about the time when I was little. So, coming to Canada and then doing my master's, I thought, well, I knew I wanted to study something about Nigeria in regards to extraction. And I thought, why not study the Ogonis, which are pretty much, they've been the most affected people with regards to resource extraction in the Niger Delta. Um, so, so Ogoni land is located, in terms of location, it's located in the southeastern part of Nigeria. It's made up of 4 local governments, and it has about a population of 832,000 people, and it's just over 1,000 kilometers wide. And it's mostly made up of farmers and fishermen who make their living through subsistence living. It's located in River State, and also in terms of oil spill, it's been estimated by Amnesty International about 2.1 million barrels of oil have spilled in Ogoni land. And in terms of the amount of oil that's been extracted from the region, it's close to 30 billion in terms of US dollars. And the main oil company that operates in the region is Shell, and its subsidiaries, specifically that operate in Ogoni land, is called SPDC. And Shell began its operation in Ogoni land in a place called Oloibiri in 1956, which is 4 years before Nigeria gained its independence. And so in terms of how it works, Shell has a joint venture agreement with the Nigerian government where the Nigerian government takes 55% of the revenue, and then Shell and a few other oil companies break up the remaining 39%, with Shell taking the majority because Shell does a lot of the drilling inland, whereas all the other oil companies do majority of their drilling out at sea. And so just a bit of history in regards to Shell. So I spoke about the joint venture agreement. In the 1990s, a bunch of Ogoni activists led by the late Dr. Ken Saro-Wiwa protested to the Nigerian government about the extensive environmental degradation that was happening in Ogoni land. And they brought the case to Shell and also to the Nigerian government about the extensive degradation that was happening. But the Nigerian government didn't listen. This led to a lot of violent protests. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is just to give you a brief background. This led to a lot of violent protests. And in the end, it led to 4 Ogoni activists initially being killed by their own people, because those Ogoni activists were perceived as being traitors to the cause. So they were killed by their own people. And then the Nigerian government, looking for somebody to blame, blamed it on these 9 Ogoni activists, including Ken Saro-Wiwa. And so they were brought up on false charges in a kangaroo court, and they were eventually hanged on November 10th, 1995 in Port Harcourt. And so in terms of numbers, there's been 2,341 oil spills just between 2007 and 2013 alone in the Niger Delta region. And so there's been extensive collusion between Shell executives and the Nigerian government, and with 30 villages being burnt in the 1990s and close to 2,000 civilian deaths when the Nigerian military moved in to quash any form of rebellion to the hanging of the 9 activists. So in terms of development, according to the UNDP Human Development Index, Nigeria currently ranks 152nd out of 188 countries in their ranking, and its life expectancy stands at 52.8 years, with the HDI being 0.514. In Ogoni land, that's less with the life expectancy being 51 years old and the literacy rate being at 20%. So this is just a brief timeline of events, and so I did my research. I went back to Ogoni last summer to do my fieldwork research. So I interviewed a lot of Ogoni people. So that's kind of where my research is placed. I did it in 2015 last year. So I'll come back to this chart just so we're in line. So my research question, my research aim is to look at resource curse at the micro level with the case of the Ogoni community in relation to the 2011 UNEP report. And research questions that I seek to answer are, what are community perceptions as to why the 2011 UNEP report has not been implemented? What's the relationship between oil and development in Ogoni land? And what are the implications of this report not being implemented, both theoretically and practically? And so, in terms of literature around resource curse, tends to focus a lot at the macro level regards to GDP and economic indicators. And it essentially argues that resource-rich nations tend to have less democracy, more violent conflicts, more authoritarian dictators, and so on and so forth. At the meso level, resource curse scholars have argued for regional level distinctions between mineral resource rich regions being worse off than the parts of countries that have less minerals. And then at the micro level, which is my focus, the micro level operates more at the community level, and it's case study specific. And essentially, they argue it's largely dominated by community-based research, and they examine developmental outcomes of and consequences of mineral resource abundance in specific communities. And it seeks to answer why certain communities which are rich in natural resources suffer disproportionately in terms of poverty, gender disparity, social inequality, and underdevelopment. So in terms of the theory I'm using the renter-state theory. Renter-state theory essentially argues that oil-dependent countries are largely dependent on extractive resource rent, taxes, royalties paid by transnational corporations, and essentially are susceptible to economic stagnation and political authoritarianism. And Nigeria is regarded as a mono-commodity renter state due to its extensive overdependence on petroleum revenue, which stands at 89%. So my methodology. So I was in Nigeria for 3 months last summer doing my interviews, and I got to the country 2 days after the elections had ended. So the guy at the top is General Buhari, who won the elections, and the guy at the bottom is Goodluck Jonathan, who was the incumbent who lost the elections. And so when I was in the country at that time, there was a lot of election hysteria. So during my interviews, I kind of had to incorporate issues about the election to get my participants talking. So I kind of got my methodologies that I use are qualitative methodology. I use snowball sampling. I also did a document analysis of the 2011 UNEP report, which I'm going to explain what that is in the coming slides. So I did 13 semi-structured interviews, and most of my participants were male, partly because I needed a community insider, because I'm of the Igbo ethnic group in Nigeria, and the Ogoni is a different ethnic group, and historically there's been issues which stem from the Biafran War. So for an Igbo person going to the Ogoni ethnic group to ask questions about oil, that could be very, there could be a lot of tensions around that. So I had an Ogoni community insider who led me into the community. And some people were willing to talk to me, some people were not, but those were the interviews that I got. So in terms of the 2011 UNEP report, the 2011 UNEP report stems from, it started off in 2006 when there was a reconciliation between the Nigerian government under Olusegun Obasanjo and the Ogoni community, where the president came to the people and said, okay, we need to bridge our differences based on what happened in the 1990s. And what came out of that reconciliation was that an independent body, which ended up being UNEP, should come into the community and do a detailed environmental impact assessment on the effect of oil extraction that had happened in the community. So it was a 14-month-long study, and it covered 122 kilometers of pipelines, which mostly belonged to Shell. They studied about 5,000 medical records of the residents. About 23,000 Ogoni people were interviewed, and it went to over 200 Ogoni villages. And so in terms of how the Ogoni people perceive the report, they perceive the report as being an environmental victory because it validates a lot of the discontent and claims that they had stemming from the 1990s and the death of their activists. And it shows Shell's poor business practices in Nigeria compared to other parts of the world, and its human rights violations as well. And so this is just some summary of the recommendations that were made in the report. So a lot of the recommendations and responsibility was placed on Shell. So Shell was charged with cleaning up the contaminated soil, decontamination of the groundwater, rehabilitation of the mangrove swamp, relocation of some people living in contaminated areas. There's a specific village that they mentioned in the report that had over 900 times the level of benzene hydrocarbons in their water, above the limit of the WHO's limit of, so it was 900 times above the WHO's limit of benzene hydrocarbons in their waterways, which is pretty much with a lot of people in that community dying of cancer. Okay, I've got the 5-minute warning, so I kind of have to breeze through now. So the Nigerian government had the second largest in terms of the responsibility. But a lot of the responsibility placed on the Nigerian government was around its institutional setup and its transparency with regards to monitoring of oil spills. And then the Ogoni community was charged with granting easier access to remediation teams to come and clean up the oil. And so that's just kind of a brief background on what I talked about. So 28 recommendations were made across all the three stakeholders. And so from 2011, when the report was published, to 2015, when I did my research, these are the only things that have happened in line with the report. None of the 28 recommendations that were made by UNEP have been fully implemented. In terms of Shell puts this on their website that they've done a lot of entrepreneurial youth programs where they've recruited. They had a Shell Live Wire program where they recruited 105 Ogoni youths as part of their CSR, and they gave them cash grants to start their business. So that was the only response that they've done. And then the Nigerian government set up an alternative agency called HiPrep to also organize and mobilize and improve community awareness in regards to health and environmental standards. And in the specific community that I talked about that had the high benzene levels, things got so bad that the Nigerian government had to truck in 15,000 liters of water into that specific community because the water in that community was undrinkable. And so from my findings and my talkings with my with the Ogoni community, a lot of them look at the UNEP report as a guideline towards development and sustainability. They had a they saw the Nigerian government as lacking will in terms of governance, especially speaking about the Jonathan regime. And a lot of them were sad because Goodluck Jonathan comes from the Niger Delta region. So they had a lot of hope and promise that he was going to, at least if anyone was going to bring change to their region, it was going to be someone from that specific part of the country. But he failed them miserably. And they looked at that as as a missed opportunity. And then they also have negative perceptions of Shell. An Ogoni chief told me this. He said, as we speak, there are no cars with Shell insignia that can drive into Ogoni. Some people have moved away for a better life because of health hazards. All the people living on that land are living corpses, including myself. So they also had the perception of oil as a curse in that they've not benefited from oil and its financial benefits, but whereas the rest of the country, or the other larger cities like maybe Port Harcourt, Lagos, Abuja, have seen significant development from the oil rents that has been taken literally off their lands. And also in 2015, Shell made its largest litigation settlement with the Ogonis in the UK courts, where a Bodo community in Ogoni land settled out of court for £55 million for two spills that happened in 2008 and 2009. So when I asked one of the community members, I asked him, does he see this being replicated by other community members? He said, I will say that the Bodo settlement is successful, but it cannot be repeated elsewhere because of the circumstances that led to its claim being successful are very unique and will be hard to repeat in other oil producing communities in Nigeria. It's very unlikely that this pattern will be copied or might repeat itself in other ongoing future claims. The Bodo community is a brief moment, and we are happy with Shell for its financial payout. So that community was just happy with Shell for this brief financial payout. But the reason why when I looked into it, the reason why he didn't agree that this could be repeated is because the Bodo community, in terms of the Ogonis, have the most educated people. So they had the biggest access to a lot of international NGOs, which helped push their lawsuits against Shell in international courts, because they didn't see any success coming from within Nigeria itself. And so for some recommendations that they recommended, they wanted a full and complete enactment of the UNEP report. Also, they wanted the introduction of the PI, the Petroleum Industry Bill, a complete cleanup of all the oil spills that were happening in their community. And they also wanted the Nigerian government to take greater responsibility for what was happening in terms of environmental degradation in the Niger Delta. And so in conclusion, the 2011 UNEP report, although it has the potential to address some aspect of the resource cost at the micro level, poor implementation has meant that neither the report has been implemented nor the resource cost addressed. Therefore, this raises question about the emerging discourse of a quadruple partnership between United Nations, i.e. through UNEP, oil companies, Shell, and the host communities. This hopefully addresses and challenges the resource cost and the widely held view that ethnicity is a hindrance to development in extractive economies, as seen from the lack of Goodluck Jonathan's unwillingness to implement the UNEP report. In terms of the implication of the non-implementation of the report, the theoretical implication is that conflict resolution within the rentier context, where the state tends to be more allocated and productive, thereby diminishing the capacity to deal with such issues. The Nigerian government essentially has created an enabling environment which instigates corporate social development in the Niger Delta to be non-existent. At the practical level of not implementing the study's recommendation is that the Nigerian government has failed in its social responsibility to the Ogoni people as Nigerian citizens. And thank you.